So I think it's that special time where we're starting now. So. Ooh, I know.
How can I tell the difference?
Oh, it's 2:10. That's basically it. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. I'm going to let the audience know what they can expect and how this session is going to work. And it's going to be free-flowing. If we get boring, let us know. We'll bring on Dustin. Dustin's got a great
Dustin's like the Joker, is sort of like everyone's stuck. You just bring in Dustin.
Dustin, come on in. I know he's ready to go. Okay, so hi audience. Thank you for joining us. So this is the UX panel. It's a deep dive. And since this is essentially a conversation about conversations, we're going to try to make it as conversational as possible. And what that means is that you can ask us questions at any point, and we're going to try to address your questions. And so we're here for the next 50 minutes, roughly speaking. So this is going to be like a big deep dive. We've come up with 4 or 5 topics that we want to talk about. And we're going to move from one to the next. As we're within a topic, you can ask as many questions as you like. As the moderator, I'm going to try to look and see those questions and bring them up. Also, if there's something that you guys want us to talk about more, or something that we haven't brought up that you want us to talk about, just go to the stage, go to the Q&A, and put that topic in there. And then the ones that get voted the most, with the most thumbs up, we'll bring those up as topics as the conversation progresses. So I hope that makes sense, and when we could start this conversation about conversations.
Sounds good.
Well, okay, so I think that most people know who you guys are. So why don't we introduce ourselves, just in case people don't know who Hans van Damm is.
So my name is Hans van Damm. I'm one of the founders here at Conversation Design Institute. We used to be called Robocopy, so some people might know that name. What we do is really recognize, develop, and promote the role of the conversation designer, and we provide training, certification programs, and consultancy around conversation design.
And you're a good conversation designer.
Sorry?
I said, and you're a good conversation designer.
Yeah, I've designed a few bots. Yeah.
And Vittorio?
And yeah, hello everyone. I'm Vittorio. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Botsociety. It's great to be here, Stefan. Always a great conference. I'm very excited. And if you don't know what Botsociety is, it's a conversation design tool. You can think about it like Sketch or Figma or Photoshop, but for chatbots and voice interfaces. You can design and prototype and test out, and then you can export to Dialogflow, to Rasa, and to a lot of other platforms. So you don't really have to worry about the technology that your team will pick. You don't have to worry about the platform, because we support any platform out there, even the ones that do not exist yet. And that's true. And so you can try it out for free. You just write Botsociety on Google, skip our competitors who are bidding against our keyword, and just go for the real deal. And yeah, personally, what more can I add? I've been a big fan of this conference since day one, and we started to talk about conversation design, I think, back in 2017, and I think at the time everybody thought we were crazy, and I think people still think that, but now it's for other reasons. So that's a good thing.
I think you already bring up a good point there, because when we started like 3 years ago, like I had to explain to people what conversation design was, and it was like a big thing. It's like they had invested in technology, they were not getting the value, and we were like, well, you need to focus on conversation design and create human-centric experiences. And that's where our mission of recognizing that role came from. And now it's really convincing that now everybody needs conversation design, or you're part of the shopping list and everybody wants to design. So it's changed so much in those 3 years. And Stefan has always been, I guess you've always been on the frontiers of that, because you were in this very early. So
yeah, so my name's Stefan. I'm the host of the conference and the founder of Chatbots Life. we're one of the largest magazines on chatbots, and we were doing a lot of projects early on. And design is just a great way to solve problems that a lot of times engineering can't solve yet, right? So like your NLP is going to have certain limitations, and you can design around those limitations. And to us, like, it seemed really obvious that was such a superpower, right? And I think most people take conversation design very lightly because every person you talk to knows how to talk, right? So by virtue of you talking and thinking and talking like, every day, you think you're an expert at it, but we find out that, maybe not. and so it's one of these really nuanced roles. And I think finally companies are starting to recognize, and they're starting to put it at the forefront. Like when we were first doing our workshops, Hans, we would start out with conversational design because like it's better to design something before you develop it. And we were losing people because people wanted to develop it first. And then they wanted to, design it second, which was like, okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think because people still think like the conversation design, even now, is like an add-on for like a UX designer or something. But the way we sort of now see it is that if you have these big platform shapes, when first you had like a graphical computer and everybody started talking about, interface design and graphical interface design. And then with mobile first, it became, UX design became like digital UX design because it became a thing because you had multiple channels and multiple touch points and became an entire industry in and of its own. And now it's like the conversational interface requires conversation design. So it's not like, an add-on for UX design. No, it's going to be as big as UX design currently is. And you're going to have all these different nuanced roles within the realm of conversation design. And I think that's really what companies need to understand. And the question I always like to ask with enterprise, like, how many UX designers do you have? But that's how many conversation designers you're going to have 5 years from now. It's really like, just like you cannot imagine a company without engineers today, you cannot imagine a company without conversation designers 5 years from now, because everybody's looking to automate conversations with people. And for that, you need technology and you need people. And those people are conversation designers, right? It's really that simple in a way.
Yeah, no, I concur. So Hans, you put together a wonderful list of topics for us. And we could start with the first one. I think the first one was, what is conversational design?
And,
I'm going off of memory, so.
Yeah, there's so many ways to answer that question, and I think we've come, on a long journey. And last week we looked at each other and we said, it's configuring a chatbot. At the end of the day, it's that simple. But it's really creating human-centric conversational experiences. How do you unlock the potential of conversational AI? We have the technology to automate conversations with people at scale, but how do you want to talk to these people? How do you make these robots sound, pleasant? How do you make them inclusive? How do you make sure that you deliver value for both the customers and the enterprise? All of that is conversation design, and we initially, what we already see 3 roles. So we sort of the three roles that we see in conversation design is the AI trainer. That's the person that trains your language model, that makes sure that we understand what people say. But just as it is important to understand what people say, it's also important that you make sure that people feel understood. And that's where conversation design comes in as how do you create empathy? How do you create the structure of the conversation? Then you've got conversational copywriters that, really turn words into resonating dialogue, that think about personality, that think about behavior design, to sort of guide people towards, their end goals. And so conversation design is really making robots speak human, while driving value for both customers and the enterprise, I would say.
Yeah. Vittorio, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Hans said. I think there's a lot of like with everything about design, it's always a very hard question to answer, right? Like, what is the user experience design is also a very hard question. And so there's multiple ways of looking at it. I think if you're approaching conversation design, I mean, kind of like a more down-to-earth, hands-on way of thinking about it is, you can structure the way that your bot express itself in such a way that it's easier to use, that in the same way that you can structure, the button of a form so that when it's in, at the bottom right and it's green, just more people click on it. You can structure the way that the bot talks and asks questions in the same way. So kind of intuitively, you can see that there's something there, even with the same technology behind it. That's kind of like, I would say, the down-to-earth version. And then, of course, like, the more you go up, there's everything there. And as Hans said, like, I think one of the fascinating things is that when you're having a conversation, you are communicating on a lot of different levels. And kind of like in the same way that you're communicating with a graphical design. So, for example, like in a graphical design, you're communicating with colors, and in a conversation design, you're communicating with a personality. And that's something that your users will perceive, and that influences your brand and the experience. But it's not something that you can pinpoint in the same way as a color. So there's a lot of art in it that goes into this kind of stuff.
I like that. That makes a ton of sense. And I like how you say it, because the persona is like the soul. And if you have so little real estate in a conversation, so you need to make everything count. And how do you make sure that people stay engaged? And that comes from personality. And where you might use with specific colors to evoke a certain emotion, here it's just sort of the wording of certain things. So I like that comparison. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is, because I often get that question of companies where, like, okay, I'm just doing an MVP, or I'm just like, it's not that big yet. Do I need to really do everything? Do I need to really invest in personality? Do I really need to focus on the psychology yet? And I came up with like this very simple thing, is like, the more conversations you have, the better they should be. Where I just saw these axes of, like, if your volume goes up of the number of automated conversations, the better that user experience should be. So if you say, I'm just building an MVP, or I just get it to work, like if you take like the UX pyramid of usable to delightful, sort of as a scale, and the different steps in between, then you don't have to do a delightful experience in terms of design when you're just building an MVP for an internal chatbot. But as soon as the number of conversations go up, that's when you want to create a better experience, develop more capabilities around that, build your team around that, and sort of start growing it as a discipline within your organization in a way as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, if you're building an MVP, arguably you will put, as a total percentage of effort, you will put more into design, because basically you will need to figure out, for example, the right use case to start off from for the MVP, which is going to be, smaller in scope compared to the final bot, right? And so which one should we test first? It's basically a design question. And so you will need to spend some design time there. Like, I don't know, just to make an example, like you may probably spend like 50% of the time on the design for an MVP, versus maybe once, you got your bot up and running, maybe you will spend more time on engineering out of the total. So it's going to be maybe 30% time designing, for example. So I totally see that happening. And it's kind of I think the interesting part about being able to design something before you build it is this, that you can, without involving the engineering team, without having to, go through deployment and API integration and all that kind of stuff, you can validate some of your ideas and some of the user reactions to what you have in mind faster.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, because we like that too. Because our thing was always like, people don't start building anything yet. Keep it super lightweight. Like, we will even, before we even start working with Botsociety, we will even sketch stuff out just on paper. And really the core of the design workflow as we have it is, when you have your use case, you sort of mentalize the context of the conversation, right? What's happening? How do people feel when they reach out? What are motivated by? What are their anxieties? Then we have the conversation out loud in role-playing exercise to hear how it sounds. And that's how we create our first draft. And then you very quickly make that design inclusive through Wizard of Oz test by validating it with multiple people and see if it still holds up and if it makes sense. And then during an expert rewrite, we optimize that conversation for behavior, right? So let's say I want to sell you a pair of sneakers, and during my little Wizard of Oz validation thing, I discover that you're maybe not ready to buy yet. Well, and then I optimize for behavior by maybe using social proof or scarcity to create that. And I can do that very lightly, very quickly, no engineers involved, and I can test it. I know it's going to work. And if that works, and this is all sort of what we call happy conversation design, that's when we go into build mode and testing that, and first use Botsociety to sort of create that prototype, see if it holds up, and that's when you hand over to engineers. So for us, part of the conversational AI team, there's usually no engineers in it. It's like AI trainers, designers, and copywriters. And sometimes you call on an engineer to create like an integration or something if you need it.
Yeah. Hans, would you say that that's the right team approach? Say enterprise thinking about whether they should create an FAQ bot or an e-commerce bot to sell their sneakers. And we've come up with this a few times, and it's a question that happens a lot. How do we put together our first team, and who leads the first team?
Yeah. So the team there. So what we see a lot of the mistake that's being made a lot is putting engineers in the team, and because the problem is if you put engineers in the team, they're going to be engineering 40 hours a week, right? And you don't necessarily need that. So assuming that you've got a chatbot, whatever technology deployed, and that's up and running, then it's really about configuring it in a way, right? So if we look at the core teams that are performing the best, there's the three roles: AI trainer, conversation designer, and copywriter. And the ratio in general is 3-to-1. So 3 AI trainers, 2 conversation designers, 1 copywriter. If you look at that, it makes sense because the AI trainer focuses on the artificial brain, and the designer and copywriter focus on the human brain. So you have a fair balance between the human experience and the AI experience. So that's kind of the ratio that we see in teams, and depending on how many deployments you have, how many use cases, etc., how many conversations you have, how big is that team? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you always need 6 people, right? But that's sort of the balance and ratio between the different disciplines. So a lot of times the AI trainer is also doing the design work, or if you got two designers, one will be a bit more technical doing the AI training, the other one will be a better writer and focusing a bit more on the copy. But we've sort of really discovered the 3 different skill sets that are required there, and the ratio between them is 3-to-1.
Yeah, one of the themes of this event has been data-driven design, and we've seen it with a number of sessions before. Riot Games used it in their session. They talked about how they implement it. Later on in our Zero to Launch panel, they're going to talk about how they're using data to launch. Nestle launched their bot. Before they launched their bot, they had a bunch of data that they used from a conversation with their customer service support. So can we talk a little bit more about how to use data, even when you're first putting together your proof of concept or your MVP, like as a guide to creating that first design on Botsociety?
Should I pick it up, or do you want to go, Hans? I can pick it up.
So you take the lead. I'll follow up.
Yeah. So we have a lot of visibility on customers who are building complex interactions. So we do not see a lot of like bots that like have 2 questions and they end up there. We usually work with bigger teams, and sometimes they're also working on their own conversational platform. So for example, like they have their bot into their own mobile app, so they can control the type of messages that are shared. For example, a special video or, panel and stuff like that. And you can design that kind of special messages in Botsociety as well. And so they have a lot of data because if you control also the platform, you have a lot more data. And so what we see is that it's always extremely interesting to analyze the data before the bot in a way that informs where the pain points are or what is interesting for the users, right? Because I mean, it probably doesn't sound so interesting. It sounds kind of immediate, but the things that the users talk the most with humans are usually the stuff that they will talk the most with bots, usually. Unless it's a very particular topic. So in that regard, it's interesting, but it's a double-edged sword because you need to consider that the way that you talk with a bot, it's going to be completely different from a user point of view. So like if you try to mimic exactly the same experience, it's not going to work. So that's a double-edged sword of like using the data before the bot is built or the current, say, customer support data, stuff like that. So that's definitely there. And then of course, once the bot is running, then you have two types of data that informs your decisions. So one is, okay, the users are talking about something that we have in our design that we wanted to address, but we know we need more training data. We need to address the question asked in a different way. And that's one data point. I think what we see, what is more interesting from our point of view as pure conversation design, perspective, is when users are expressing new needs based on the experience of the initial bot. And so the example that I always make is the work that we have done with Air France, where they started with a very simple bot that was managing only the luggage questions. Can I bring my luggage? Is this too big? What happens if I lose it, et cetera, et cetera. But then that experience was so good that then users started to ask other stuff, right? And then that's a good thing. But in the data, it expresses itself as intents not found, right? And so that's another double-edged sword of like the running bot that like if you do a good job, the bar is going to get higher. And so you need to kind of like read the data in the right way there as a push to add new capabilities to the bot.
Yeah, what Hans was saying is the more conversations you have, the better experience users have, the more expectations they have, the higher the bar goes.
Yeah. And ultimately, you're going to be adding to scope. You're going to deliver more. You're going to be, you got to go broader with more use cases, and you're going to, go deeper as well to unlock more value. When we sort of, if you look at the backlog of a design team, there's usually like three sources of where these items come from. They come from business leaders, like business departments that say, I want these and these use cases in there. They come from data science, more generic, of finding problems that could be solved through a conversational interface. And they come from the analytics of the deployed chatbot, right? And those three sort of add to the backlog of the design team. And then if you start looking at, how do I train for each specific use case, like Vittorio says, you can look at a lot of historic conversations that you've had in live channels, but it's not necessarily the way you would want to talk to people. It's not necessarily how they will ask the questions of when they know they're talking to an AI assistant. So sure, you can take a lot of that training data and use it. At the same time, if you want to make sure you have a very inclusive, properly working AI assistant, it also just makes sense to have a diverse team of designers doing the wizard. And they creating sort of their training phrases and sort of, so you use the historic data. You have a team that writes training phrases. Also during the Wizard of Oz test, if you actually have your first draft, you let people interact with it. What they say is what you can use as a training phrase as well, right? But now, if you start growing and sort of your corpus grows as a whole, you're gonna have competing intents. And I think Qbox was referenced in the previous talk as well. But you're gonna get a whole new set of challenges where you're gonna have competing intents. So you want to restructure that, and a whole big challenge starts to emerge there. You're going to be if you want to solve that problem, you're going to be pretty far removed from those initial training phrases that you set out with when you started this entire conversational AI adventure, right? So taken all of those historic conversations from live chat and phone, sure, it's great. A lot of the stuff also but use it as one variable, just one source. There's multiple sources, and also find a use case. A lot of times, go to the call center, talk to a bunch of agents. Like, you can save yourself a lot of expensive data science hours doing that way. So there's a lot of like common sense plus data is like the combination, instead of just trusting data blindly, because you're going to waste a lot of time and you're going to make some mistakes down the line as well.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions from the audience, and then if you guys are audience members, feel free to throw in as many questions as you can at us. That's why we're here. We want to make this as conversational as possible. So Monica asks, what training data would you use to build an app or a service or a company for a bot that you don't have any data for? So for example, if you're starting from scratch and you don't have anything to go on, even in that situation, you can kind of use data. And what are some of the ways that you can do it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's what Hans was pointing at just right now. So it's a great segue. I think the best way in our experience is to have the person. So short answer is you will need to craft your initial set of training phrases. Because of the reason that me and Hans were explaining before, like people talk in a different way to humans and bots. So you cannot just use, the logs of your, sales call transcriptions or customer support tickets with humans to just copy paste them into utterances, because that's not going to work. Because people were expressing them differently. We found a lot of success and that also what Hans was saying. So I kind of just agreeing there with the Wizard of Oz approach, which basically means you have sessions with users, with actual folks. You put them in front of your bot or of also a Botsociety design. You can do that. So even if you don't have the bot yet, and then you see how they react, and you use that as a starting point for your utterances. I do not advise to collect all of the utterances that way, although it's possible, but it's just, you need to run a lot of tests to do that. But in my experience, if you get 5 or 10 of those, then you can kind of create your own variations there.
Yeah, but with those variations, let's say, I think the official quote is, if you put 4 white guys from Stanford in a room, they're going to create something that works very well for 4 white guys from Stanford.
Yeah.
But so here it does become important, if you're not using any of that data and you're just starting something from scratch, to bring in a diverse team and just bring in a bunch of people, because you're going to be surprised by how many different ways there are to ask a simple question. So you might be excluding a lot of people, and then even if particularly if it is like a small project without historic data, and you sort of ignore potentially 80% of the population, you're really getting into a danger zone there. So make sure to cover that.
Hans, what's a good example of that? In terms of conversations or things that might be a blind spot. I don't want to say if you had 4 white guys from Stanford, but if what are some things that are obvious that would be missed as a result of having, I guess, not a full array of the data that's out there? You're just mostly focusing on just a piece of it.
I mean, there's, I guess, having very specific examples is tricky, because you may also insult people, but I think it's important to be inclusive in how you understand people's linguistic preferences. So people with different cultural backgrounds may use different words for specific things, but also be inclusive in how you actually then talk back to them. So it goes both ways, and the only way to solve for that, you cannot, you don't know your own biases. So have a diverse team of people. So if you know sort of what your customer base is and what kind of people are in there, you kind of want to have that represented in your design team. And it doesn't mean you can't bring 100 people into your team. That's why the Wizard of Oz, try to play around with it, have this conversation, test it out with lots of people. Like as a designer, if you create something, you can go home and you're at home with your partner. You can actually just have the conversation, test it out real quick, see if it works, right, and see what doesn't work, and that way you iterate, and there's just a lot of blind spots, and just be aware of that.
And just to add on top of that, Stefan, I want to say, like, I think it's particularly difficult with language to be inclusive, because language is by itself always an expression of your culture in a very deep way, and in a way that you cannot really perceive straight up. So the example that I always make is that if you're from the US, you actually use a lot of expressions that are related to the Far West pioneering era, right? You always say stuff like, give me a shot, he's a gunslinger, stuff like that. And you don't even realize that, right? It's not like if I say, give everyone a fair shot, you think about the gun and you think about, you don't even think about that anymore. And so that's how much, like, you can have a deep blind spot given your culture, given your background. And of course, like, that can get, this example is kind of, harmless, but you can think about less harmless situations where kind of ignoring that will create a very bad experience for users. So and also, like,
if this was a Smith & Wesson bot, Smith & Wesson, the gun company.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
We'll give you guys a shot.
Don't do that. But also, like, even regional expressions, right? Like saying Audi in the US, if you're not from the South, maybe you don't think about it. You don't put it in any of your utterances. Just a stupid, very simple example. And if you don't have anybody, from that region in the team, that's definitely something you will not, like, I can assure you 90% of the time you won't think about that. And the moment that you start to get deeper on these things, and that you move into, like, racial blind spots or gender blind spots, that's where you need, it's not harmless anymore. And so I think if you take the stance that, like, okay, we try to be inclusive, and we know that we will have blind spots because that's just how culture works. Like, there's nothing you can do about that. And you try to be inclusive, then you can do a great job. And we see this a lot, to be honest. Like, I don't think that we have even one customer, for example, that is creating a bot in one language only, for example, which is crazy. Like, even 2 years ago, this was crazy. So
I see. So, okay, because one of the comments here from the chat is that, you as a business, you should know your customers, you should know your audience. And make sure they're represented in your design decisions, which I think is obvious. But to your point, most bots are bilingual now, whereas most people aren't. At least not here. I have another question from where it go? Zara. Can you talk about the conversation design and end-to-end training of chatbots versus the conversation design work for intent-based chatbots?
Yeah, that's sorry, I'm jumping on it since I don't see Hans jumping on it. I think it's a great question. I think I was also very excited about previous talks, the one by Alan about going beyond intents, the one by Maria before. So at Botsociety, we're really excited about this idea that intents are not the only way to model a conversation. And we think that the right approach in terms of conversation design, and this is a bleeding edge, so it's one of the few cases where maybe me and Hans, we didn't sync on this, so I hope we're going to agree, otherwise it's going to be a wonderful panel. But what we see is like it's best if you start with a final user experience without thinking about intents, without thinking about the structure. Of course, you need to know how bots work in order to design. It's a good thing, but if you start thinking about the intent before the final user experience, you're not really doing a good service, I think, in terms of design thinking. And there are tools that encourage you to do that, like Botsociety. There are other tools that forces you in these boxes, which it's really not helpful in my opinion. But anyway, and so if you focus on the final user experience first, then it's easier to work back the technology and say, okay, here is end-to-end, here is intent-based, here we switch to FAQ mode with Elasticsearch or whatever. But only when it makes sense for the final user. And if it makes sense for the final user, then it's quote unquote gonna work, because the bot and the user will understand each other. You will get to the point where it doesn't matter, because the user doesn't want to know. Like if you ask a user, do you want a bot with end-to-end or with intent management, the user is going to say, what? Like the user doesn't care, and it has to make sense for the user.
Yeah, I'm on the same page here, Vittorio. I feel like I disappoint you, man. I can't really go against you here. No, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really like, what's the conversation you want to have, right? And as an organization, like you have certain issues, what's the type of conversation that you want to have, and that's what you need to design for. And then, during the design process, so we have this canvas that we use where we sort of have like the human's perspective and the AI's perspective to solve a certain use case, and you do want to have some, technical perspective in there as a guide to the designers, because you don't want them going off the rails entirely to come up with something that's just impossible. So it's like, all right, these are sort of the parameters within which you can design a conversation. Like don't design for a magic super AI that can solve every problem. We can look up an address. We can kind of do that. Like sort of give them those types of guidelines. And then it's creating the human experience in the most efficient way. And then you start thinking about the limitations more and more. So, yeah.
So we have a question from Anonymous. He says, beyond using entities to extract data like food type data, etc., do you also use entities to enhance intent training? So, for example, certain intents and entities might have some correlation, and do you guys use them in training in order to help enhance the other?
Yeah, I think so. Like I don't go into the greatest detail, so we have people that would be better at answering that question. But all I can say is yes, I know that they do. but we have, our AI trainers are much better at AI training than I am, because I'm more I'm a poet rather than an AI trainer.
That's funny. And what are your thoughts, Vittorio?
Yeah, I don't have a very strong opinion on this. We've seen that. I think it really depends, like what's the objective there. I think in some situations it may be useful, but in my experience, in a lot of cases, it's not strictly needed. Because to really like have that work in a way that moves the needle, you need a lot of data, and maybe that's maybe you don't have it, maybe you don't need it. So in general, like what I'm trying to say is like there's a lot of techniques that you can employ for NLP and data management. And again, like Hans was saying, this is not our focus, but it's my experience. And there's plenty of technique. It doesn't mean you need to use every of them to get the job done. It really depends, like what your objective is, and even in the same bot, maybe for some intents you need to go deeper and have this sort of correlation, but maybe it's just one that is particularly complex, So
yeah, and also what Torben says in the chat will obviously also place. It's like it even depends if a platform even allows for that. Not all of them do, but I think it's good to sort of be aware that if you really get the scale that, trying to, and you have hundreds of use cases in there, then simply training a little better and making use of these types of things to understand questions, like you're going to be building and qualifying layers and umbrella dialogues to take people by the hand much more, because if you have 200 FAQs in there and they're all sort of related to each other, there, you can train that AI as much as you want, but there's going to be a few steps in between to get them to the right question, because you're just going to have too many competing intents. So then these types of approaches are like, all right, is it worth that if you do that for everyone, right? And there's like more efficient ways to sort of get to the same end goal of helping this customer.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that another important thing from a conversation design point of view is that it's really, really important to be technology agnostic. So you really don't want to be bound, and maybe I'm saying this against my interest, but like you don't want to be bound to a certain technology, especially if it's about like natural language processing. And because there are some things that Dialogflow does really well, there are some things that Rasa does really well, there are some things that Microsoft Framework do really well, and stuff like that. And as a designer, I think the best tool set is kind of like being able to navigate those, and that will in turn empower your engineering team to kind of like pick the best tool for the job, versus like being forced to go down a certain solution that maybe it's not the best for that specific bot or sub-bot. Like we actually have customers who have multiple bots, and some of them are on one tech and some of them are on another, depending on like the need.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of comes up, and I think that a few people brought it up in the chat, and this kind of goes back to our previous topic of bias, and that is like, what's a good way to address differences in conversational style, for example, without sounding hollow? Because like, imagine if I try to sound like, hip or something like that. Probably won't go very well.
You can do it. You can do it, man. Okay. Don't underestimate yourself.
Thank you for your confidence, Hans, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think that, and again, I'm jumping because I don't see Hans jumping. Hans, more aggressive. Please.
So sorry. So how do we make sure that we understand our audience well enough and have the right tone of voice? Was that sort of the thing?
Yeah, I think it's more like how do you make sure that like you're not trying to mimic something you're not when you're designing.
You're not like the old dad that's trying to be cool like the kids, for example.
Yeah, I mean that's why it's also, if you develop a persona, even before you start developing any conversations, what we do is really look at to what extent am I technically capable of automating conversations? What are the conversations that I'm going to be having? Who am I going to be having them with? And who's best to have these conversations on our behalf? And that's our bot persona that we develop, right? So it makes sense for the types of use case that we're going to be doing with the people that we're going to be having them with. And that bot persona needs to be crafted very well. Because if let's say, you say, oh, yeah, it's like a 23-year-old hip person from San Francisco. That's like, it doesn't mean anything, right? So that's what you're gonna have if you have a writing team and they have to work with a character that doesn't resonate with them. It's gonna be terrible because they don't know how to write for that, right? So a lot of times when you say you need a bot persona and a team, you need to talk in a way that makes sense for the audience, and it's off. A lot of times it has to do with the prep work where the character is just not properly defined. Because if you write it in if you develop that character, you give more depth to it and a true backstory, and everybody in the organization understands the tone of voice of that bot, then it becomes easier for them to write for it as well. Because now if I develop a chatbot called Vittorio, everybody in the team can say, how would Vittorio say this? And if it's off, then somebody say, this doesn't make sense, this is off, right? So if it's disconnected to the audience, it often means that there's not enough depth to the character and it's not been adopted well enough by the design team. And that's how you sort of navigate through that, and it's a lot. Yeah, it's a big problem because if you're at an enterprise, you got like 5 conversation designers. They switch jobs. You got to onboard new people. They're busy, so you lose that tone of voice very quickly. So it's so important that they all understand who it is as a real person. So that, and then it becomes, if you really understand that, then it becomes easier to write like it as well.
Right. So last question, because I think we only got 5 minutes.
Oh wow!
And this one, I think Hans, you could probably talk for 5 hours. I don't think 5 minutes is going to be enough. We'll try.
Sorry, right?
I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just serious. Nimit asks, can you briefly discuss user testing for a chatbot? So how do you make sure that you're validating that users can, go down the happy flow and use testing techniques? And I think this will also lead into what we're doing tomorrow, but we'll talk about that in 5 minutes. So to jump in, Vittorio and Hans.
Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting topic. I think you need to, so first of all, there's different levels of testing for a bot, okay? So you can test a bot in terms of UX in the same way that you test a mobile app UX. And you can test it functionally. So like, okay, the bot is up, is it working? And so, and probably something in between, but basically there's these two kind of like situations where if you're testing for UX, you're trying to validate your design assumptions. That's the objective of the test. And you usually do that in the very early stages of design to validate it and to make sure that you're on the right track. And for example, with Botsociety, we have a feature to do that. So you can just do it by yourself as a designer. You can invite as many people as possible, etc. And I think what is interesting about that is that it gives you a very important insight about how people will react to your bot. Because the interface, the conversational interfaces are so new that it's still kind of hard to fully predict how people will react to the way that your bot starts the conversation, for example, to the first message or to a follow-up message and stuff like that. In the same way that, like, if you take a look at the original Space Jam website of 1996, like the menu, it's a GIF animated that is spinning at the center because they had no idea that people wanted to go on the top left for the menu, right? So they were just trying things out, and we're still in the early days of these interfaces. So that's one part of testing. Yeah, exactly. And for the latter testing, so like, okay, now we have the NLU up, we have the bot up. Let's see if our change, if we change something, will it break and stuff like that. That's kind of a different type of testing. There's a lot of interesting companies that are going after that, like Bespoken, that allow you to set up kind of like a continuous integration testing and stuff like that. But it's kind of a different, more engineering focused, more kind of like integration testing approach, which it's very different. And I feel like right now in this phase, sometimes we're talking about testing in general, but actually there's a lot to unpack there. So yeah.
So I think we've hit our time, and I think IBM's next. But before I let you guys go, Vittorio, if people want to follow up with you, what's the best way?
So I think it's following me on LinkedIn or signing up on Botsociety. You will end up in our newsletter if you sign up. So I can share my LinkedIn profile in the chat.
Perfect. And you can, if you message Vittorio, he'll tell you all his secrets.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to message me. Just no, but I'm serious. Like on average, I have 3 calls with just random users from Botsociety every week. So.
Okay, and next, Hans, we're actually doing a workshop tomorrow. So if you guys want to know how to actually design a bot, Hans is going to show you exactly how to do it. Hans, can you talk a little bit about the workshop? Yeah,
so tomorrow is going to be good fun. So we'll have a few people of the CDI team, and we're going to do like a lecture really first. It's like theory behind designing these conversations. So talking about the psychology, how to create these flows, copywriting techniques, very specific Jenga technique, acknowledgement, confirmation, prompts, like all of the stuff we're going to talk about, and then we're going to sort of develop a use case, and then Kojouharov is going to take over, and that's when people are going to start building it. So first we look at the theory, then we're going to sort of sketch out the first concepts, and then we start building it.
Yeah, exactly. And we've designed it in such a way where today you guys could discover, what works best, what are the best use cases, what is NLP and how to deploy it, and what's the best ways to apply it, what's conversational design, how can we think about design, how can we apply it. And then tomorrow you're actually going to do it. And tomorrow's going to be the design day. And then on Thursday is going to be your development day, where you're actually going to use Dialogflow and NLP, and you're going to develop the bot that you designed the day prior. And that's with bot copy and Google. So you're going to actually make a bot. So and then you're going to be able to take that back to your business or your team, and hopefully you guys have something to really show off. So also there's a link here, and you can sign up and upgrade and add either one of those 2 workshops if you haven't already done so. So thanks Hans and Vittorio for joining us. And Hans, I'll see you tomorrow. And Vittorio, I'll probably see you tomorrow too.
Thank you so much. It was great fun. I really enjoyed it.
It was great.
Thank you so much, everybody in the chat.
Yes, feel free to chat with our attendees. Next up.